The Liang Dynasty didn't simply spring into being as though someone flicked a switch. It was the culmination of centuries of fracture, blood, and yearning for stability. To appreciate its rise, you've got to picture southern China around the turn of the 6th century. The Han Dynasty, once the towering symbol of Chinese unity, was long gone, and the people had lived for generations under the patchwork of shifting regimes that followed. First came the Three Kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy while exhausting their people in endless wars. Then, when those gave way, the Jiang tried to restore something like unity, only to fracture again under the weight of court intrigue and nomadic invasions from the north. By the time we reached the southern dynasties, the Song, then the Qi, the south had become both a refuge and a prison. It was where Han Chinese culture thrived, rich in poetry, painting, and philosophy, but it was also where instability never quite loosened its grip. Dynasties lasted decades, not centuries, and emperors often rose to power only to be consumed by the very violence they unleashed. The Southern Qi dynasty, which immediately preceded the Liang, is a case in point. It was a state constantly gnawed at by its own paranoia. Emperors, haunted by fears of betrayal, executed brothers, cousins, and even their own sons on the flimsiest suspicions. Ministers knew that serving too well was as dangerous as serving poorly, because competence made you a threat. Soldiers fought loyally, only to be discarded when political winds shifted. Imagine the atmosphere. The capital at Jiang glittering with wealth, gold ornaments, silken robes, Buddhist temples echoing with chants, while behind the palace doors, emperors drew up lists of who should be executed next. The common people, of course, had little power in these dramas, but they felt the instability in harsher taxes, forced conscription, and the constant threat that their fields might be trampled by yet another warlord marching toward the capital. What's striking about this world is its duality. On one hand, you have refinement, the literati writing verses about moonlit rivers, monks debating fine points of Buddhist doctrine, calligraphers perfecting brush strokes. On the other hand, you have brutality, executions in palace courtyards, families torn apart by suspicion, armies burning villages just to deny food to their enemies. It's like two plays running on the same stage, one about beauty and transcendence, the other about fear and cruelty. For the average villager, these weren't abstract tensions, they were lived realities. You might wake to the sound of temple bells one morning and the sound of soldiers demanding grain the next. That constant sense of fragility weighed heavily on everyone, from farmers to generals. It was into this fractured, weary world that Xiaoyan would eventually step. But before we get to him, it's worth pausing on the atmosphere itself, because the Liang dynasty's very existence was born out of that yearning for something steadier. People weren't looking for miracles. They weren't demanding grand visions of empires stretching across the known world. They just wanted predictability. They wanted an emperor who wouldn't murder his brothers on a whim, a court that wouldn't bankrupt them with reckless spending, and generals who didn't switch sides every other year. In a way, that longing for stability created a vacuum, a hunger for a man who could project reliability. The Liang rose because Xiaoyan managed to step into that role, to embody that promise, even if only temporarily. Think of it like a cracked jar. Each dynasty patched the breaks just enough to keep water from spilling out entirely, but none could mend it fully. The southern Qi had too many fractures to survive. And when it finally began to crumble, everyone, generals, ministers, farmers, and even Buddhist monks, looked around to see who might take up the jar and hold it steady again. Xiaoyan would become that man. His rise wasn't just about seizing power, it was about responding to a century's worth of exhaustion. That's what made the Liang different, at least at first. It promised, however briefly, to stop the endless cycle of paranoia and collapse. Whether it fulfilled that promise is another matter, but in 502, as the old order collapsed, the hope of stability was enough to make people rally behind a new banner. Xiaoyan's early life and career often feel less like the polished origin story of a dynasty founder and more like the slow burn of a man learning to navigate a world that seemed perpetually tilted toward betrayal. Born in 464, he came into an environment where family background could be both a blessing and a curse. His clan had respectable standing and a history of service, But it wasn't the kind of pedigree that guaranteed untouchable influence. In fact, in the southern Qi dynasty where Xiaoyan spent his youth, any family that became too prominent risked destruction. Ambitious emperors saw noble houses not as partners but as rivals waiting to rebel, and the usual solution was preemptive slaughter. For a boy growing up in that atmosphere, lessons came fast and often harsh. Speak carefully, move cautiously, and never stand taller than the emperor until the moment is absolutely right. From a young age, Xiaoyan displayed a combination of qualities that marked him as unusual. He was clever without being reckless, ambitious without being obvious, and most importantly, disciplined. Unlike many young aristocrats who wasted time on luxury, he studied both the classics and military arts, crafting himself into a figure who could straddle two worlds. He could recite verses, debate philosophy, and appreciate painting, but he also learned the art of command, the structure of armies, and the logistics of moving men and supplies. This balance mattered because southern China in his era didn't just need generals or scholars, it needed leaders who could pivot between the battlefield and the study hall. Xiaoyan grew into just that sort of man. His early military career was cautious but effective. He entered service as a low-ranking officer, distinguished not by acts of wild bravery but by his ability to remain steady under pressure. If there was one trait that defined him, it was patience. He understood that victories weren't always about flashy maneuvers. Sometimes survival was the greatest triumph. That attitude earned him the respect of fellow officers, who noticed that he didn't throw men into suicidal charges just to make himself look good. For soldiers used to commanders who treated them like disposable tools, this kind of leadership built loyalty that would endure long after the battles themselves were forgotten. But Xiaoyan wasn't simply a military man. He had a sharp sense of court politics, which in the southern Qi were notoriously treacherous. Emperors executed brothers and nephews on suspicion alone. Ministers rose one day and fell the next, often literally losing their heads. It was in this theater of paranoia that Xiaoyan learned the art of survival. He kept his ambitions muted, cloaking them beneath loyalty and modesty. Outwardly, he was the ideal servant, competent, reliable, and unthreatening. Inwardly, though, he was taking notes. Who held real power, who could be trusted, which families were destined to fall. This quiet observation became his greatest weapon. The Qi court during his formative years was, frankly, a disaster. The emperors alternated between cruelty and weakness, never striking the balance needed to inspire loyalty. In one infamous instance, the emperor executed entire branches of his family simply because astrologers whispered of ill omens. Officials lined their pockets with bribes while the treasury ran dry, and armies were dispatched on campaigns with no strategy beyond march and hope. These failures weren't just embarrassing, they were destructive, eroding faith in the dynasty's ability to govern. Xiaoyan witnessed it all and absorbed the lesson. A dynasty without discipline, without moral authority, could not last. It's important to remember that Xiaoyan didn't rush to seize power the moment he saw chaos. He played the long game. He forged friendships with fellow officers, men who would later become his backbone when he reached higher. He built alliances not through promises of wealth, though he could offer that later, but through shared experience and trust built in hardship. He also cultivated his image as a man of culture, surrounding himself with scholars and engaging in discussions that gave him a reputation beyond the barracks. People began to whisper that here was a man who understood not only war but governance, not only command but compassion. In hindsight, Xiaoyan's early career feels almost like the careful drawing of a map. Each friendship was a mark on the parchment, each observation a line connecting dangers and opportunities. He was charting a course through a storm where others rushed blindly into the waves. Many of his contemporaries rose quickly, grasped too much, and fell hard. Xiaoyan waited. He understood that timing mattered more than boldness, and that if he could stay alive while others destroyed themselves, the path to power would eventually clear. By the time the Qi dynasty reached its most unstable years, Xiaoyan was no longer just another officer. He had gathered loyal men, cultivated an image of virtue, and positioned himself so that when the old order stumbled, he could step forward without appearing as a usurper but as a savior. That patience, that ability to blend ambition with restraint, would carry him to the throne. But in these early years, it was still forming, a young man sharpening the tools he would one day use to cut through the rotten edifice of a crumbling dynasty. Xiaoyan's consolidation of military and political influence was not the stuff of instant conquests or dramatic proclamations. It was quieter, slower, almost like the steady tightening of a rope until, suddenly, there was no room for anyone else to breathe. After years of patient service under the Southern Qi, he had built a reputation as a cautious but reliable commander. Yet reputation alone wasn't enough to topple dynasties. What mattered was translating that reputation into networks of loyalty so resilient that when the time came, men would risk their lives for him. And Xiaoyan did this with a subtlety that almost defies the stereotype of ambitious usurpers. He wasn't a man who slammed his fist on the table demanding power. He was the man who kept the table steady until everyone around him realized that without his hand, it would collapse. He began, as so many successful rulers do, by deepening his base in the military. Soldiers in southern China were weary of reckless campaigns that cost lives for little gain, and they remembered who treated them as expendable and who didn't. Xiaoyan never wasted men to win glory. He would wait, maneuver, probe, and only when the conditions favored him would he strike hard. This patience on the battlefield mirrored his patience in politics. The rank and file began to talk of him as different, as someone who didn't view them as pawns. And in a world where loyalty was often bought with coin, earning it with respect made his hold on them much harder to break. Officers, too, gravitated toward him. They admired his discipline, his ability to calculate risks, and the fact that he rewarded competence rather than favoritism. Slowly, his military circle became less a collection of subordinates and more a brotherhood bound by shared faith in his leadership. At the same time, Xiaoyan was careful to craft an image that reached beyond the barracks. He courted scholars, poets, and monks, building a persona that was more than just a sword arm. In a society where the Confucian ideal of the cultivated ruler still held enormous sway, this mattered immensely. To the learned men of Jiang, Xiaoyan wasn't merely another ambitious general. He was someone who read their verses, debated Buddhist metaphysics, and respected ritual. He looked like a man who could bring refinement and order to a state suffocating under brutality and suspicion. And so his name began to circulate not just in military reports, but in scholarly gatherings. He became, in the eyes of many, a bridge between martial strength and cultural legitimacy. That balance was rare, and it set him apart. But what really marked this period was his uncanny instinct for timing. He did not rush at the throne when the Southern Qi first began to totter. Others did, and they paid the price with their heads. Xiaoyan waited until his rivals exhausted themselves in plots and counterplots, until the ruling house grew so paranoid and corrupt that its authority was more a shadow than a substance. He played the part of the loyal servant, carefully avoiding the appearance of threat. When summoned, he obeyed. When ordered, he complied. Yet behind the curtain, he was quietly drawing more and more troops under his command, placing allies in key positions and building alliances with governors who feared the capital's instability more than they feared him. It was a masterclass in biding one's time. By the late 490s, the Southern Qi court was so riddled with suspicion that emperors were killing capable ministers simply because they dreamed of rebellion, literally dreamed, as in omens and rumors were enough to justify execution. Trust between court and provinces collapsed. Local commanders began to hedge their bets, waiting to see who would outlast the others. Many of them looked at Xiaoyan and saw a figure who might deliver stability. Not necessarily because they were enthralled by his charisma, but because in a world where everyone else lunged recklessly, his steadiness felt like the only reliable anchor. The culmination of this quiet consolidation came around 501. By then, Xiaoyan commanded enough soldiers, held enough alliances, and had gathered enough legitimacy in the eyes of scholars and officials that the scales tipped. The Qi dynasty was crumbling from within, emperors consumed by fear, aristocrats scheming against one another, the treasury bleeding out. Xiaoyan no longer needed to storm the palace. He only needed to maneuver carefully, and the throne would almost fall into his lap. And that's essentially what happened. He orchestrated events so deftly that when the old emperor's authority collapsed, he was the obvious replacement. There was no dramatic conquest, no rivers of blood flowing into the capital, just the quiet realization that the man who had already kept order in practice would now keep it in name. What stands out about Xiao Yan's consolidation is how human it feels. It wasn't driven by some grand ideology or sweeping plan of reform at first. It was the result of a man who learned to survive in a world of paranoia, who built trust brick by brick, who mastered the art of waiting. While others chased glory and fell, he gathered loyalty and strength until no one else could challenge him. And when the time came in 502, the Liang Dynasty would be proclaimed not with a shout, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide that had been rising all along. The founding of the Liang Dynasty in 502 wasn't a thunderclap moment in which the heavens split and a new era burst into being. It was more like the gradual shift of a river's course, steady at first, then unstoppable. When Xiao Yan finally moved to take the throne, the world around him was already so frayed that his rise felt less like a usurpation and more like a repair. The southern Qi had wasted its strength on paranoia and cruelty. Emperors had murdered brothers, nephews, cousins. They had alienated their armies and their officials. They had bankrupted the treasury while peasants shouldered unbearable tax burdens. People didn't need to be persuaded that the dynasty was finished. They lived its collapse every day. What they needed was a figure who could claim not only power but legitimacy, someone who could convince them that the endless cycle of instability might finally pause. That someone was Xiao Yan. By 502, his military power was undeniable. He controlled troops across key provinces and held the loyalty of commanders who trusted his discipline. But just as crucially, he had cultivated the aura of cultural and moral authority that southern China prized. Scholars saw him as a man who respected learning. Monks saw him as a patron who treated Buddhism not as a political tool, but as a genuine faith. Even ordinary villagers, who had never met him, began to hear stories of a commander who spared his men needlessly wasted deaths, who valued justice, who carried himself with calm dignity. In a land worn down by cynical rulers, that reputation mattered more than gold. When the Qi court faltered yet again in the face of factional disputes, Xiao Yan made his move. He didn't storm into Jiang in a blaze of swords. He orchestrated the transfer of power so carefully that it appeared almost seamless. The reigning emperor, childless and already a puppet of court factions, was coaxed into abdication. And just like that, Xiao Yan became Emperor Wu of Liang. It was less a coup than a coronation already waiting to happen. The court, weary of chaos, accepted him. The officials, desperate for order, pledged loyalty. The army, already his, simply followed where he led. And the people, who had endured generations of dynasties that flared and failed, allowed themselves to hope once again. The symbolism of the moment is worth lingering on. In Chinese political philosophy, the idea of the mandate of heaven loomed large, the belief that dynasties rose and fell according to divine will, revealed through prosperity or disaster. By 502, the disasters of the Qi dynasty had convinced everyone that heaven's mandate had shifted. Xiao Yan didn't need to declare himself chosen. The evidence of heaven's displeasure with the Qi was written in famine, rebellion, and betrayal. By contrast, his rise, bloodless, orderly, almost natural, seemed like proof that heaven now favored him. For the literati and the common folk alike, the transition was not just political, but cosmic, a rebalancing of the natural order. Once enthroned, Emperor Wu of Liang wasted no time projecting the image of a ruler unlike his predecessors. He issued decrees promoting Confucian values of stability and morality. He began reforms aimed at easing tax burdens, restoring faith in administration, and curbing the worst excesses of aristocratic privilege. He patronized Buddhism with unprecedented enthusiasm, funding temples and inviting monks to court. And while some officials muttered that his devotion to religion was excessive, the broader population saw in it a moral compass, an emperor guided not by paranoia or indulgence, but by principles. The contrast with the Qi emperors was stark, and in politics, Contrast is often more powerful than perfection. The founding of the Liang wasn't just the beginning of a new dynasty, it was the crafting of a new narrative. People who had lived through years of suspicion and terror suddenly found themselves with an emperor who talked about virtue, who read poetry, who cared for order. It felt like stepping from a storm into a calm courtyard, where the lanterns glowed softly and the air was steady for the first time in memory. Of course, the storm hadn't vanished. Beyond the capital, threats loomed, northern way to the north, restive governors in the provinces, and the ever-present danger of rebellion. But in those early years, none of that mattered as much as the sense of breathing room. For a brief moment, people believed in the possibility of stability. What makes this founding so fascinating is how understated it was. So many dynasties in Chinese history began with rivers of blood, cities burning, and the conqueror proclaiming himself by force. Liang was different. It began with a quiet handover, with the appearance of legitimacy, with the weariness of a society ready to accept change without protest. That quietness was both its strength and, eventually, its vulnerability. For in the absence of decisive rupture, the old habits of instability were not erased, they merely waited, lurking beneath the surface. But for the moment, in 502, all that mattered was that the Liang had been born, and Xiaoyan, now Emperor Wu, stood as the man who had turned years of patience into the throne itself. Emperor Wu's early reforms and the promise of stability were the heartbeat of the Liang Dynasty's first years, the reason people still speak of his reign as one of the rare bright moments in the age of the southern dynasties. To understand their significance, you have to place yourself in the shoes of his subjects. For decades, ordinary farmers and city dwellers alike had lived under a carousel of emperors who cared more for silencing rivals than governing. Taxes shifted unpredictably, soldiers marched through villages, stripping fields bare, courts bled silver to fund palaces even as peasants starved. So when Emperor Wu came to power in 502, expectations weren't lofty. People didn't dream of golden ages or utopias, they simply hoped for an end to fear and chaos. From the outset, Emperor Wu signaled he intended to govern differently. He reduced the extravagant punishments that had become routine under the Qi rulers, curbing executions and purges that had decimated both the aristocracy and the bureaucracy. Officials no longer felt they were living on borrowed time. Where the Qi court had punished competence out of paranoia, Emperor Wu rewarded merit. Capable administrators were promoted, corrupt ones dismissed, and for a brief moment, officials began to believe that serving the throne might not be a death sentence. This alone stabilized the machinery of government, allowing decrees to be carried out with more consistency than the people had seen in years. Taxes, always the sorest nerve in any agrarian empire, became one of his early focuses. He didn't eliminate them, no emperor could, but he streamlined collection, reducing arbitrary levies that had crept in under the Qi. Where once local officials had bled villages with overlapping demands, Emperor Wu worked to clarify obligations, making it harder for greedy tax collectors to exploit loopholes. Peasants noticed. Even if their burden wasn't light, it became more predictable, and predictability meant the difference between despair and endurance. Farmers who knew what they owed could plan their planting, store grain, and pay without losing everything. In a society that lived so close to the edge of subsistence, that kind of consistency felt like a blessing. He also invested in infrastructure, particularly the maintenance of canals and dikes along the Yangtze. Flood control and irrigation were lifelines for agriculture, and neglect in previous reigns had turned natural disasters into political ones. By restoring waterworks, Emperor Wu not only protected harvests, but also demonstrated that the state could serve the people rather than exploit them. It's telling that records of his reign highlight this attention to practical governance. People remembered that the emperor looked not just to palaces, but to fields, not just to armies, but to harvests. But perhaps the most striking feature of Emperor Wu's early reforms was his devotion to moral governance. Deeply influenced by both Confucian ideals and Buddhist teachings, he presented himself as a ruler guided by virtue. He emphasized frugality in the court, discouraging the kind of reckless spending that had drained the Qi treasury. He patronized Buddhist monasteries, not only out of piety, but also to weave the moral authority of religion into his reign. Monks preached peace and charity under imperial sponsorship, and while some criticized his generosity toward temples as excessive, it created an atmosphere where governance felt anchored in higher principles. To a population weary of cynical emperors, this mattered. It suggested that power could be exercised with restraint, even compassion. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Aristocrats accustomed to luxury grumbled at restrictions. Some officials worried that Emperor Wu's Buddhist leanings might undermine Confucian traditions of hierarchy and ritual. Yet, even they had to admit that the early years of his reign were remarkably stable. Rebellions were fewer, the capital calmer, and the empire's coffers, though not overflowing, no longer hemorrhaged like before. For once, the machinery of the state seemed to align, however briefly, with the well-being of its people. It's worth pausing here to think about how extraordinary that was in context. The southern dynasties were notorious for rapid collapses, for emperors who lasted barely longer than the ink on their edicts. And yet, in the early Liang, there was breathing room. Scholars flourished, farmers harvested with less fear, soldiers stood down from endless campaigns. It was as if the entire empire exhaled at once. People told stories of the emperor's personal simplicity, how he rejected excess and surrounded himself with learned men instead of flatterers. Whether all of these anecdotes are true or not almost doesn't matter. The fact that they circulated shows how desperately people wanted to believe their emperor was different. For Emperor Wu, these reforms weren't just policies, they were part of a carefully constructed image. He wanted to be remembered not as a usurper who toppled the Qi, but as a moral ruler who restored order and virtue. And in those early years, it worked. The Liang Dynasty began not with fire and fury, but with quiet confidence, a promise that stability could replace suspicion, and that governance could once again serve the empire rather than destroy it. Whether that promise could last was another question entirely, but in the beginning, it felt like hope had finally returned to southern China. Culture, literature, and Buddhist patronage under Emperor Wu were not side notes to his reign, they were its defining soul. If the early reforms gave people bread and safety, his cultural vision gave them a sense of meaning, of belonging to something greater than just another dynasty struggling to survive. From the very beginning, Emperor Wu made it clear that he wasn't content to rule as a mere general-turned-sovereign. He wanted his court to be a beacon of refinement, a place where poetry, philosophy, and faith intertwined to shape not only politics, but the very spirit of the age. Let's start with the literary atmosphere. Southern China had always prided itself on its cultured elites. Even in times of war, scholars wrote verses comparing the Yangtze's flowing waters to the fleeting nature of life, or painting in words the serenity of a lotus blooming despite muddy roots. Under Emperor Wu, this tradition found new vigor. He gathered poets and scholars to his court, creating circles where intellectuals debated Confucian classics, shared innovations in calligraphy, and crafted essays that blended moral philosophy with elegant artistry. The emperor himself participated. Unlike rulers who merely tolerated scholars, Wu fancied himself one of them. He composed verses, hosted discussions, and surrounded himself with men whose reputations were built on the brush rather than the sword. This was not just for show, it was his way of projecting himself as a cultured sage king, the embodiment of both intellect and virtue. Art and music also blossomed. Court painters experimented with themes that drew from Buddhist imagery, blending Indian motifs with Chinese landscapes. Musicians adapted melodies from foreign lands, creating performances that dazzled audiences with their novelty. To outsiders, Jiang must have seemed like a paradox, a city buzzing with the energy of trade and politics, yet also pulsing with the rhythm of chants, poems, and the brushstrokes of calligraphers. It was a reminder that, even in times of instability, culture could bloom, sometimes most brilliantly in the cracks of empire. And then there was Buddhism, the centerpiece of Emperor Wu's cultural vision. His patronage of the religion was unprecedented among Southern Dynasty's rulers. He didn't merely tolerate monks or donate the occasional sum to temples. He embraced Buddhism so fervently that it became inseparable from his reign. He built monasteries across the empire, endowed them with land and resources, and invited prominent monks to advise him at court. He even staged ceremonies where he symbolically renounced his throne, taking vows as a monk before redeeming himself back into kingship, a dramatic blending of worldly and spiritual authority that left contemporaries in awe. For ordinary people, this devotion was proof that their emperor was guided by more than greed. To see the Son of Heaven kneel in robes, chanting with monks, sent a powerful message about humility and moral purpose. Of course, not everyone celebrated this zeal. Confucian officials muttered that the emperor was diverting too much wealth into monasteries, draining resources that should have gone to the state. They feared that Buddhist egalitarianism might undermine social hierarchies so central to Confucian order. Some military leaders complained that soldiers were encouraged to take vows or seek refuge in temples rather than serve in the field. These criticisms weren't unfounded. Buddhist patronage did redirect wealth, and it did complicate the balance of power between state and aristocracy. But for a while, the benefits outweighed the risks. The religion's emphasis on compassion, nonviolence, and charity resonated in a society traumatized by decades of bloodshed. Temples provided food, shelter, and education, functioning as community anchors when the state alone couldn't meet people's needs. The interplay of literature and Buddhism also shaped Liang's intellectual climate. Monks translated sutras into Chinese with imperial support, enriching the language with new ideas and metaphors. Poets infused their works with Buddhist themes of impermanence and enlightenment, while Buddhist art borrowed from traditional Chinese aesthetics to create images that felt both foreign and familiar. This cross-pollination gave the Liang Dynasty a distinctive cultural identity, one that fused the elegance of Southern literati traditions with the expansive spirituality of Buddhism. What made all this remarkable was how it elevated the image of the dynasty itself. While northern China under the Northern Wei was experimenting with its own Buddhist patronage and political reforms, the Liang presented itself as the refined southern alternative, a realm where stability, virtue, and culture thrived under an emperor who was both ruler and philosopher. To the people of Jiang, this cultural flowering wasn't abstract. They saw it in the temples rising on their streets, in the poems recited at gatherings, in the chants drifting from monasteries at dawn. It gave texture to their daily lives and a sense of belonging to a dynasty that stood for more than survival. And yet, as rich as this cultural bloom was, it carried within it the seeds of vulnerability. By tying his reign so closely to Buddhism, Emperor Wu also made the state dependent on its institutions, and critics would later seize on this as a weakness. But in those early years, none of that mattered. The Liang Dynasty, through its literature and patronage, projected an image of balance, a state grounded in governance, softened by compassion, and elevated by culture. For a people long battered by the storms of politics, this was not just rule, it was renewal. The Liang's growing bureaucracy and central control under Emperor Wu might sound dry on the surface: paperwork, registers, officials in tall hats bent over scrolls, but in truth, this machinery was the skeleton that held his dynasty upright. Without it, all the poetry, temples, and moral proclamations would have crumbled into air. Governing an empire, even one limited to southern China, wasn't simply about charisma or battlefield victories. It was about making sure taxes were collected, laws enforced, roads maintained, and rebellions detected before they grew teeth. Emperor Wu understood this better than most. He had lived through the Southern Qi, a dynasty where suspicion and incompetence rotted the state from the inside. He wasn't going to repeat that mistake. From the moment he seized power, he set about expanding and strengthening the bureaucracy. That meant promoting men based on competence rather than family ties, a radical idea in an age where aristocratic clans guarded their privileges like dragons hoarding treasure. Under the Qi, powerful families could essentially buy their way into offices, using their influence to protect their wealth while the empire staggered. Wu clipped their wings. He didn't eliminate aristocratic power, no emperor could, but he diluted it by elevating scholars and administrators of humbler backgrounds who proved their ability through service. This gave him a core of officials who owed their positions not to their lineage, but to him personally. It was both a practical reform and a political strategy. By widening the pool of talent, he improved governance while tightening loyalty to the throne. Record-keeping became a central focus. Land registers were updated, tax rolls clarified, and census counts conducted with more rigor than before. In a society where taxation was the empire's lifeblood, accuracy mattered. Too many ghost households on the registers meant lost revenue. Too much overcounting sparked unrest. By making the system cleaner, Wu not only secured the treasury, but also reduced the petty abuses of corrupt local officials who had long exploited murky records to squeeze peasants. People noticed the difference. For once, their obligations felt less arbitrary, less like a constant roulette of demands. Predictability, in a farming society, was almost as valuable as mercy. The legal system, too, received attention. Laws that had been harshly applied under the Qi were softened, with more emphasis on moral correction than brutal punishment. This shift reflected both Confucian ideals of governance and Wu's personal Buddhist leanings. He wanted to project an image of a humane ruler who corrected wrongs without cruelty. But make no mistake, the state's hand was still firm. Rebellions were crushed without hesitation, and threats to central authority were not tolerated. The difference was in presentation. Justice under Wu felt more measured, more consistent, less capricious than under his predecessors. That consistency built trust, even among elites who might otherwise have plotted against him. Central control also extended to communication and transportation. Canals and roads were repaired and expanded, ensuring that orders from Jiang could reach distant provinces quickly. Messengers and inspectors traveled more efficiently, carrying not just decrees, but also information back to the capital. In an era where distance often bred rebellion, this mattered enormously. A governor in a far-flung region could no longer act with impunity, knowing that imperial eyes and ears might arrive at his door within weeks. At the same time, merchants benefited from improved infrastructure, boosting trade and swelling the empire's coffers. Stability wasn't just enforced from above, it became woven into the daily rhythms of commerce and travel. Of course, this growing bureaucracy came at a cost. Expanding the machinery of government required resources, which meant more officials to support, more scribes to train, more institutions to maintain. Critics complained of bloat, of too many layers between the emperor's will and its execution. Some aristocrats grumbled that their traditional privileges were being eroded, that their family's grip on power was slipping into the hands of new men whose only claim to authority was imperial favor. These tensions simmered beneath the surface, and while they didn't explode in Wu's early years, they formed cracks that would widen later. Still, in the moment, the benefits were undeniable. The Liang court became known for order, for a degree of administrative clarity rare in the southern dynasties. Foreign envoys noted the efficiency of its officials. Merchants praised the relative security of travel through Liang territory. Farmers, though never free of burdens, found that the system at least treated them with more consistency than the wild swings of past reigns. It wasn't utopia, but it was functional, and functionality in an age of chaos felt like a revelation. What made this bureaucracy distinctive wasn't just its efficiency, but the way it reinforced Emperor Wu's image. Every decree issued, every tax collected, every canal repaired became part of a larger narrative, that he was a ruler who governed not through whim but through structure, not through fear but through fairness. It lent his reign a sense of legitimacy beyond the battlefield, anchoring his dynasty in institutions rather than in his personal charisma alone. That was rare, and for a time, it worked brilliantly. The Liang Dynasty's military structure and frontier defense were, in many ways, the hidden scaffolding of Emperor Wu's reign. While the people of Jiang saw poetry recited in court halls, monks chanting sutras in newly built monasteries, and officials issuing neat tax registers, beyond the city walls there loomed a reality that no dynasty could afford to ignore. China was divided, and the north was dangerous. The northern Wei, sprawling and powerful, dominated the steppe and much of northern China. Their cavalry-heavy armies could sweep across plains with terrifying speed, and they looked southward with both ambition and suspicion. For Emperor Wu, holding the throne wasn't just about cultivating culture, it was about ensuring that the Yangtze remained a shield and that his armies could respond to threats before they shattered the fragile stability he had worked so hard to build. The Liang army was built less on raw conquest and more on defense. Geography played a part in this. The Yangtze River was the dynasty's great moat, wide and difficult for northern armies to cross in force. Southern commanders had long relied on it as a natural barrier, stationing fleets along its waters and fortifying river crossings. Wu strengthened this tradition. He ordered repairs and expansions of river defenses, ensured that naval forces were adequately supplied, and treated the Yangtze not just as a boundary but as a lifeline. Patrols along the river became routine, not only to deter invasion but also to keep smuggling and banditry in check. In an empire that relied on waterborne trade as much as land routes, control of the river was as much about economics as it was about defense. The structure of the Liang military was a blend of old and new. On the one hand, aristocratic families still provided many of the commanders, their prestige ensuring authority over troops. On the other hand, Wu increasingly appointed men who had proven loyalty to him personally, often drawn from his circle of longtime allies. This created a dual system, some armies tied to powerful clans, others directly bound to the emperor. It wasn't foolproof. Aristocratic commanders still had room to maneuver and occasionally resist imperial authority, but it gave Wu a counterbalance. He could rely on his own networks to check the ambitions of great families. The rank-and-file soldiers were mostly peasants conscripted into service, supplemented by professional troops stationed near the capital. Service was grueling, but Wu attempted to ease burdens by rotating units and ensuring that soldiers' families received some support during their absence. This policy wasn't always successful. Logistics in such a fractured empire were a nightmare, but the effort itself built goodwill. Soldiers, much like peasants, valued predictability. Knowing they wouldn't be kept indefinitely in the field mattered. Wu's attempt to institutionalize this predictability distinguished his army from the often haphazard levies of earlier dynasties. One of the greatest challenges for Liang defense was cavalry, or rather, the lack of it. The northern states, especially the Northern Wei, excelled in horse warfare. Their armies could strike with speed and flexibility that the infantry-heavy southern armies struggled to match. Wu recognized this disadvantage. He attempted to bolster cavalry by encouraging horse breeding in the south, but geography was against him. The lush, wet environment of the Yangtze Basin simply couldn't sustain the massive herds needed for a true cavalry force. Instead, Wu relied on naval strength and fortified defenses, essentially reshaping the Liang military identity around holding ground rather than pursuing glory in open-field battles. This defensive orientation shaped the psychology of the Liang. The court projected cultural superiority. Southern literati often looked down on the barbarized north, but underneath that pride lay a constant awareness of vulnerability. Liang armies weren't built to sweep north and unify China by force. They were built to endure, to buy time, to ensure that the empire behind the Yangtze could flourish in relative peace. It was a strategy of survival, not ambition, and for a while, it worked. The North had its own problems, internal divisions, succession crises, and rest-of-step allies, and Wu knew how to exploit moments of weakness, sending expeditions to nibble at border territories when the opportunity arose. But he never overreached. His wars were probing, calculated, never so ambitious as to drain the empire's lifeblood. Of course, this cautious military strategy carried risks. By relying so heavily on the Yangtze and a defensive posture, the Liang left itself little room to project strength outward. The army became less a tool of expansion and more a shield. And shields, while essential, can only hold as long as the arm behind them remains strong. As Wu aged and court politics grew more tangled, that arm would weaken, and the shield would begin to crack. For now, though, in the early decades of his reign, the system functioned. Soldiers guarded river crossings, fleets patrolled waters, garrisons manned fortresses, and the people of Jiang could recite poetry without fear of northern horsemen storming their gates. There's something almost poignant about this arrangement. The Liang Dynasty, for all its cultural brilliance, lived under a constant shadow, its defenses like a candle shielding against the wind. Wu's genius was to accept this reality, to shape his military into a buffer that bought his people decades of relative calm. It wasn't glorious conquest. It wasn't empire building on a grand scale. But for the farmers along the Yangtze, for the monks chanting in their temples, for the scholars writing verses about lotus blossoms and moonlit rivers, it was enough. Defense held the line so that culture could flourish. And in the Liang, that trade-off defined an era. Relations with Northern Wei and the shifting alliances that defined them were a constant thread running through Emperor Wu's reign, shaping not only the military posture of the Liang, but also its diplomacy, economy, and even its self-image. You could say that the Liang Dynasty never really had the luxury of forgetting about its northern neighbor. The Northern Wei wasn't just a rival, it was a looming presence, vast and powerful, pressing down on the Yellow River Plain with an army that could, at least in theory, sweep southward at will. The Yangtze might have been a natural moat, but a moat doesn't erase anxiety, it just delays it. The Northern Wei, by Emperor Wu's time, was a hybrid state. Its rulers descended from the Tuoba Xinbei, a nomadic people from the steppe who had settled into northern China. They had adopted Chinese institutions, sponsored Buddhism, and tried to present themselves as legitimate heirs of the imperial tradition, even while their armies remained steeped in steppe-style cavalry warfare. To southern elites, this dual identity was unsettling. On one hand, they saw the Wei as barbarized, tainted by nomadic roots. On the other, they knew the Wei court was sophisticated, wealthy, and formidable. That contradiction produced a mix of disdain and dread in Liang politics, a superiority complex that masked deep insecurity. Emperor Wu had no illusions about conquering the north. His military strategy, as we've seen, was defensive. But diplomacy offered another way to manage the balance. Envoys traveled back and forth between Jiang and the Wei capital, carrying gifts, titles, and proposals. On the surface, these exchanges were about ritual, recognizing each other's legitimacy, honoring hierarchies, but beneath the formality lay constant calculation. Both sides knew that peace was preferable to war, but both also watched for signs of weakness. A single misstep could turn a polite exchange of gifts into the prelude to invasion. Wu was particularly skilled at exploiting the internal fractures within the Northern Wei. That state, though strong, was far from stable. Factional struggles at court, ethnic tensions between the Tuoba elite and their Han Chinese subjects, and the sheer size of the realm made it vulnerable to division. Whenever turmoil erupted in the north, succession disputes, uprisings, or administrative crises, Wu would probe at the edges. Sometimes he encouraged defectors, welcoming disaffected generals or refugees into Liang territory. Other times he launched limited campaigns, seizing border territories when Wei attention was elsewhere. These weren't grand offensives meant to topple the north. They were opportunistic nibbles, meant to secure advantage without overextending. But diplomacy wasn't just about Wei itself. The geopolitical chessboard of the time was filled with minor states, shifting alliances, and tribal groups who could tip the balance in unexpected ways. Liang envoys courted alliances with steppe peoples who might harass Wei borders, creating breathing room for the south. They also tried to influence splinter states that occasionally emerged from Wei's internal crises. Wu understood that sometimes survival depended not on outmatching your enemy directly, but on ensuring your enemy had too many fires to put out at once. Relations weren't always stable. Periods of peace often gave way to skirmishes, raids, and accusations of betrayal. The two dynasties traded hostilities like seasons, alternating between uneasy calm and sudden bursts of conflict. For the people living in border regions, this meant life was a pendulum. One year envoys bearing silk and horses passed through, the next year soldiers torched fields in punitive expeditions. For Jiankong's court, it was a constant balancing act, never entirely sure whether the next envoy from the north would bring a treaty or a threat. And yet, these fraught relations shaped Liang identity in profound ways. Southern elites often defined themselves in contrast to the north. They portrayed the Liang as the bastion of true Han Chinese culture, refined, literate, steeped in Confucian and Buddhist tradition, while dismissing the Wei as a corrupted hybrid of nomadic and Chinese elements. This cultural posturing bolstered Emperor Wu's own legitimacy. By patronizing literature and Buddhism so lavishly, he made the Liang court a showcase of true civilization, implicitly contrasting it with the militarized pragmatism of the Wei. It was propaganda, of course, but propaganda that resonated deeply with his subjects. At the same time, these relations exposed the Liang's vulnerability. Every embassy sent north was a reminder that survival required diplomacy as much as defense. Every skirmish reinforced the reality that the dynasty could not afford complacency. Wu may have projected serenity in his Buddhist devotions and cultural patronage, but behind that serenity lay constant vigilance. The Liang might sing of lotus blossoms and enlightenment, but its armies and envoys never forgot that the Wei loomed just beyond the river. The story of Liang-Wei relations is thus one of fragile equilibrium. Neither side could fully conquer the other, and so they danced, sometimes exchanging gifts, sometimes trading blows, always circling, always watching. For Emperor Wu, managing this relationship was one of his greatest tests. And for a while, he succeeded. His dynasty survived not because it was invulnerable, but because he understood that in a divided China, survival itself was victory. Economic life under the Liang Dynasty was the quiet heartbeat beneath all the poetry, temples, and military maneuvering, a rhythm carried by farmers bent over paddies, merchants hauling goods along canals, and tax collectors tallying bundles of grain in village courtyards. If the bureaucracy was the skeleton and the army the shield, then the economy was the blood that kept everything alive. And like blood, it could be drained, replenished, or poisoned, shaping the health of the dynasty more than most emperors cared to admit. Emperor Wu, for all his cultural ideals and religious devotion, knew that his rule would collapse if the economic foundations cracked. So he paid attention to them, at least in the early years, and it's here that the Liang dynasty managed to achieve a fragile stability that sustained its reputation for prosperity. Farming was the backbone, as it had been in every Chinese dynasty before and after. The Yangtze Basin, with its fertile soil and abundant water, gave Liang rulers a natural advantage. Rice cultivation flourished, sustaining dense populations and providing surplus for taxation. Farmers operated in small family units, planting and harvesting by hand, often using tools that hadn't changed in centuries. Their lives were hard but predictable. They owed grain and labor to the state, rent to landlords if they didn't own their fields, and offerings to temples or local shrines. In a sense, they carried three dynasties on their backs: the imperial court, the aristocratic landlords, and the spiritual institutions. Emperor Wu's reforms, by clarifying tax burdens and cracking down on corruption, gave them some breathing space, but their existence remained precarious. A bad flood, a locust swarm, or an especially greedy local official could push entire villages into ruin. What Wu managed to do was reduce the unpredictability. Under the Qi, taxes had been arbitrary, changing with each emperor's whims or with the corruption of local magistrates. 1 year a village might be bled dry, the next left in relative peace. That chaos destroyed trust and productivity. Wu's insistence on cleaner registers and standardized obligations gave peasants at least the comfort of knowing what they owed. Predictability may not sound glamorous, but to a farmer on the edge of starvation, it could mean the difference between despair and cautious hope. That predictability also encouraged more systematic farming. People invested labor in improving their fields when they believed they wouldn't simply be stripped of the fruits. Trade added another layer. Southern China, especially around Jiang, was well-positioned for commerce. The Yangtze River acted as a highway, carrying grain, silk, ceramics, and timber from inland provinces to the capital, where markets buzzed with goods from across the empire. Canal networks, some maintained and expanded under Wu, linked regions together, while seaborne trade brought in exotic products from Southeast Asia and even India. Buddhism itself traveled these routes, carried by monks alongside merchants who traded spices, precious stones, and textiles. In this way, Liang's economy wasn't just about subsistence. It was tied into a wider network of exchange that enriched the court and exposed it to new ideas. The tax system drew from both farming and trade. Grain was the foundation, bundles collected, stored in granaries, and redistributed to feed armies and officials. But wealthier households were also taxed in textiles or coin, and merchants paid levies on goods moving through markets. Wu's emphasis on record-keeping meant that, for a time, the system ran more smoothly than in previous dynasties. But taxation was always a balancing act: too light, and the state lacked resources; too heavy, and resentment festered into rebellion. Wu tried to steer between extremes, but as with every dynasty, the burden often fell hardest on those least able to bear it. Aristocrats remained a persistent problem. Many great families owned vast estates, where peasants farmed not for the state directly but for landlords. These estates siphoned wealth that might have gone into imperial coffers, weakening central control. Wu's reforms checked aristocratic power somewhat, but he could never fully break it. The great clans were too entrenched, their networks too wide. They exploited loopholes, concealed households from tax registers, and shielded their clients from conscription. The result was a constant tug-of-war, the emperor strengthening bureaucracy on one side, the aristocrats hoarding wealth on the other. For a time, Wu held the upper hand, but the balance was never secure. It's worth noting that Buddhism itself became part of the economic landscape. Monasteries owned land, collected donations, and sometimes even engaged in lending. Critics accused them of draining wealth from the state, but temples also provided vital services, soup kitchens, schools, and shelters that eased the burdens of common people. In some regions, monasteries became economic hubs, their granaries rivaling those of local officials. For peasants, donating grain to a temple might feel more meaningful than handing it to a faceless tax collector. At least the monks prayed for them in return. All of this meant that the Liang economy was both vibrant and fragile. Vibrant in its trade, its fertile farmland, its bustling capital markets. Fragile in its dependence on stable weather, honest officials, and a balance of power that could easily tilt toward exploitation. Emperor Wu's reign, especially in its early decades, managed to harness the vibrancy while keeping fragility at bay. But fragility has a way of waiting. Later crises, rebellions, invasions, and internal rot would expose just how thin the margins really were. For now, though, the Liang economy provided the resources that made culture, diplomacy, and defense possible. Without rice in the paddies and coins in the markets, no dynasty could survive, no matter how pious or cultured its emperor claimed to be. Court life, luxury, and elite culture in the Liang Dynasty unfolded like a drama on a stage built from the sweat of farmers and the trade of merchants. Jiang, the capital, was not just a political center, it was a theater of elegance and performance, where aristocrats, ministers, and courtiers displayed their refinement, their ambitions, and sometimes their excesses. If you walked through its streets in Emperor Wu's day, you would have seen a city alive with contrasts, markets crowded with rice, silk, and spices, temples rising with gilded roofs, and palace courtyards where men in flowing robes debated philosophy by lantern light. This was the heart of Liang's elite culture, a world both dazzling and precarious. The court itself was steeped in ritual. Every morning, officials in long robes filed into audience halls, bowing before Emperor Wu as he presided with the calm of a scholar rather than the harshness of a tyrant. He preferred to cultivate an atmosphere of intellectual engagement rather than fear. Instead of surrounding himself solely with generals, he invited scholars and monks, men whose authority came from books and sutras rather than swords. Court sessions weren't just about issuing edicts, they became forums for reciting poetry, interpreting omens, and debating Buddhist philosophy. Officials vied to demonstrate not only loyalty but erudition. To be eloquent, to quote the classics with subtlety, was as valuable as offering sound military advice. This emphasis on culture seeped into elite life. Aristocratic families, who had long guarded their prestige, thrived in this environment. They held salons where poets gathered to compose verses, often set against the backdrop of carefully tended gardens with lotus ponds and bamboo groves. Calligraphy became both art and status symbol, each brushstroke a reflection of personal cultivation. Music, too, played a central role, with ensembles performing at banquets that stretched late into the night. Guests drank wine from lacquered cups, listening to flutes and zither while discussing the impermanence of life or the subtleties of Buddhist doctrine. To the aristocracy, such displays weren't mere entertainment, they were performances of legitimacy, proofs that they embodied the refinement that set them above common folk. But luxury wasn't just aesthetic, it was material. Silk robes shimmered in candlelight, embroidered with patterns of cranes, dragons, or lotus blossoms. Jewelry of jade and gold adorned the wealthy, and imported goods from Southeast Asia and India, spices, gemstones, rare woods, circulated through the capital. Banquets featured delicacies like freshwater fish, venison, and exotic fruits, alongside endless cups of rice wine. The opulence was breathtaking, but it carried a quiet edge of irony. The same wealth that funded Buddhist temples and scholarly pursuits also fueled indulgence, reinforcing the gap between elite and commoner. For Emperor Wu, court culture was both a tool and a trap. He promoted refinement to project the Liang as a dynasty of civilization, a counterpoint to the militarized north. Yet in doing so, he allowed elites to sink deeper into luxury, creating a court where appearance often mattered more than substance. Scholars penned elegant verses, but corruption still whispered through the halls. Aristocrats held banquets while peasants labored under taxes. Monks chanted sutras in gilded halls, yet the donations that supported them came from fields worked by bent backs and calloused hands. The Liang court embodied both the glory and the contradictions of southern Chinese elite culture. It's worth noting how religion shaped court life. Buddhism wasn't only a spiritual devotion, it became a fashion of sorts among elites. Aristocratic women commissioned elaborate statues of Buddhas, carved from jade or bronze, while noblemen sponsored temples to display their piety. Pilgrimages to famous monasteries became social events as much as religious journeys. Emperor Wu's own devotion heightened this trend, making Buddhism not just faith, but a marker of status. Yet Confucian traditions never fully disappeared. An official might attend a Buddhist sermon one day and perform ancestral rites the next, embodying the cultural syncretism that defined Liang society. The court was also a stage of politics, where whispers mattered as much as proclamations. Behind the scenes of poetry and banquets, alliances were forged, rivalries sharpened, and conspiracies hatched. Aristocratic families jockeyed for influence, using marriages, patronage, and literary circles as weapons as potent as swords. For all the elegance, Jiankong's court remained a place where ambition simmered, and beneath the surface of cultured debate lay the raw hunger for power. Wu, patient and perceptive, often kept these rivalries in check, but they never disappeared. They were simply gilded with refinement. And this is perhaps the most striking thing about Liang elite culture, its ability to mask instability with elegance. To outsiders, the Liang court appeared as the pinnacle of southern refinement, a place where civilization thrived. To insiders, it was also a world of contradictions, virtue preached but not always practiced, refinement celebrated while inequality deepened. Yet for a time, it worked. The culture projected stability, and in a fractured age, appearances could be as important as reality. The court became a symbol, not just of Liang's strength, but of its claim to embody the heart of Chinese civilization, a claim that sustained its prestige long after its power began to wane. The tensions between the aristocracy and central power during the Liang Dynasty were like hairline fractures in a porcelain vase, hidden beneath layers of polish and elegance, but always threatening to split wide open. Emperor Wu had built his authority on a delicate balance, rewarding capable men from humbler families to weaken the grip of entrenched clans, while still relying on the prestige and influence of those very clans to govern an empire too vast for one man to control alone. That balancing act worked well enough in the dynasty's early decades, but the friction never disappeared. It smoldered under the surface of Jiankong's glittering court, sometimes whispered in private salons, sometimes breaking out in open defiance on the provincial frontiers. The great aristocratic families of southern China saw themselves not just as servants of the dynasty, but as dynasties in miniature. They owned sprawling estates worked by tenant farmers who were, in practice, more loyal to their landlords than to the emperor. These estates weren't merely economic units, they were political bases, providing wealth, manpower, and networks of patronage. In a sense, the aristocrats lived in two worlds: at court, where they recited poetry and bowed before the emperor, and in the countryside, where they exercised authority that sometimes rivaled his own. Emperor Wu understood this perfectly. He had lived under the Southern Qi, where aristocratic privilege went unchecked and corruption hollowed out the state. He wasn't going to let history repeat itself, at least not without resistance. To curb aristocratic dominance, Wu leaned heavily on his bureaucracy. By promoting officials on merit rather than lineage, he injected new blood into the system, men whose authority derived from imperial favor rather than ancestral prestige. This strategy paid dividends in governance. The state became more efficient, taxes more predictable, law enforcement less arbitrary. But it also bred resentment among the great clans. Every time a scholar from a modest background rose to a position once reserved for nobility, an aristocrat felt their world narrowing. And in a culture where family honor was currency, those resentments ran deep. Aristocrats fought back in subtle ways. They hid households from tax registers, shielding their tenant farmers from imperial demands. They used their private armies of retainers to intimidate local officials, ensuring that decrees from Jiang could be bent, delayed, or quietly ignored. They cloaked defiance in the language of loyalty, hosting lavish Buddhist ceremonies or Confucian rites to display piety even as they siphoned wealth from the state. At court, they formed literary cliques, using culture as a shield for politics. A poem about a bending bamboo might, in the right hands, become a coded critique of imperial authority. Wu, for all his intellect, wasn't deaf to these signals. He knew the polished verses often carried barbs. The emperor's Buddhist devotion complicated the picture further. Many aristocrats adopted Buddhism as a marker of status, but others clung to Confucian hierarchies that reinforced their ancestral privileges. Wu's lavish patronage of monasteries diverted wealth and land away from aristocratic estates, placing them under religious rather than noble control. This not only undercut elite power, but also gave the emperor an alternative base of legitimacy. Monasteries, loyal to their patron, could act as counterweights to noble clans. But this maneuver also fueled aristocratic resentment. To them, it seemed the emperor trusted monks more than the very families who had sustained dynasties for centuries. And then there were the provinces. Far from Jiang, aristocratic families acted with greater independence, their estates sprawling across fertile land along the Yangtze and its tributaries. Here, imperial inspectors had less reach, and local aristocrats could play emperor in miniature. They collected rents, commanded militias, and dispensed justice, sometimes acknowledging imperial decrees, sometimes ignoring them altogether. Wu's bureaucracy tried to keep tabs, but geography favored the clans. The emperor might rule Jiang, but beyond the river bends, aristocrats ruled villages, fields, and people. These tensions weren't constant explosions, they were steady pressures, like the creaking of a ship under strain. Most of the time, they remained manageable. Aristocrats enjoyed their luxuries, the emperor maintained his authority, and both sides pretended the balance was stable. But everyone knew the truth. The Liang rested on compromise, not consensus. If that compromise faltered, if the aristocrats pushed too hard or the emperor weakened, the dynasty's foundations would crack. In hindsight, it's tempting to see this tension as inevitable. Southern dynasties had always struggled with the great families, who outlasted emperors and even dynasties, their wealth and networks too deep to uproot. Wu's attempt to curtail their power was bold, but it could never fully succeed. The Liang's early stability depended on his personal authority, his ability to command loyalty from both bureaucrats and nobles. But authority tied to one man is fragile. The moment he faltered, the old tensions would surge to the surface. And when they did, they wouldn't just weaken the dynasty, they would tear it apart. Regional rebellions and cracks in authority were the inevitable tremors beneath the Liang dynasty's polished veneer, the rumblings that warned of quakes to come. No matter how refined Emperor Wu's court appeared, no matter how many poems were recited in Jiang or how many sutras were copied in monasteries, the empire's vast body was harder to control than its capital heart. Provinces stretched across the Yangtze Basin, each with its own local power brokers, governors, aristocratic clans, military commanders, whose loyalty to the emperor was often conditional at best. They bent the knee to Jiang when it suited them, but they never forgot that distance gave them leverage. And when central authority began to strain, those provincial players tested the limits of their obedience. Some of the rebellions were small, little more than uprisings sparked by local grievances. A tax collector pushed peasants too far, and suddenly fields that should have been filled with rice stalks were dotted with makeshift banners of defiance. A corrupt magistrate abused his post, and tenant farmers took up hoes and sickles against him. These local flare-ups rarely threatened the dynasty itself, but they drained resources and attention, forcing Liang officials to march troops into provinces again and again just to restore order. Each time the army rode out, granaries emptied a little faster, soldiers grew a little wearier, and the illusion of effortless stability cracked. Other threats were more serious. Some came from ambitious generals stationed far from Jiang. Military commanders were given wide authority to defend frontier regions, and with that authority came temptation. If an emperor seemed distracted or weak, a general might decide that loyalty was optional. Wu's careful balancing of aristocrats and his trusted circle worked well in the capital, but beyond it, commanders could grow restless. Sometimes they claimed to rebel in the name of justice, accusing corrupt officials of oppressing the people, while in reality, they were carving out their own fiefdoms. Such rebellions had to be crushed decisively, but each one revealed how fragile the bonds of loyalty truly were. And then there were the aristocratic families themselves, whose estates often functioned like mini-kingdoms. They didn't always raise open rebellions, but their quiet resistance weakened imperial control just as much. By hiding taxable households, sheltering retainers from conscription, or defying inspectors, they chipped away at the emperor's authority. In some regions, peasants knew their landlord's word carried more weight than an imperial edict. That blurred line between noble privilege and outright defiance created fertile ground for cracks in governance. Wu's bureaucracy tried to tighten control, but no system of registers or inspectors could fully overcome the entrenched power of the great clans. These cracks weren't just political, they were psychological. For the common people, rebellion and unrest blurred the line between loyalty and survival. A farmer might pay taxes to an imperial official one year, then feed rebels the next if they held his village. To him, the dynasty was less an abstract ideal than the face of whichever authority held the whip at that moment. Stability in Jiang meant little if soldiers trampled his fields or warlords demanded grain. The Liang Dynasty promised order, but in many provinces, that promise rang hollow. Emperor Wu, to his credit, managed these challenges with patience and pragmatism. He dispatched trusted generals to quell uprisings, shuffled governors to prevent them from growing too powerful, and issued proclamations appealing to Confucian virtue and Buddhist compassion alike. Sometimes it worked. Rebels laid down arms, reassured that the emperor's justice was more merciful than his predecessors. Other times it failed, and the cycle of revolt and suppression continued. Each success preserved the dynasty's image of stability, but each failure chipped away at its reserves of manpower and legitimacy. What made these regional rebellions particularly dangerous was that they often coincided with broader crises. A famine here, a flood there, and suddenly a local grievance could escalate into a movement that attracted desperate peasants, disaffected soldiers, and ambitious landlords. The Liang might boast of refined culture and enlightened governance, but nature and necessity paid little heed to poetry or sutras. Droughts, plagues, and floods struck with impartial cruelty, and when they did, the empire's cracks widened. Relief efforts were sometimes effective, but not always fast enough, and rebels found recruits among the hungry. In hindsight, these constant flare-ups show just how much of the Liang dynasty's stability depended on Emperor Wu's personal authority. He could suppress revolts while he was strong, but he couldn't erase the conditions that produced them: inequality, aristocratic resistance, and the sheer difficulty of ruling a fragmented land. The rebellions were warnings, early signs of what would later explode with devastating force in the Jing Rebellion. For the moment, though, they were manageable fires that could be stamped out, cracks that could be patched. Yet every fire left ashes, and every crack left scars. Over time, those scars weakened the whole vessel, even as the court in Jiang continued to polish the porcelain and pretend it was whole. The personal rule of Emperor Wu and his style of governance were the lifeblood of the Liang Dynasty, so much so that the line between man and dynasty blurred. When people spoke of Liang's prosperity, they spoke of Wu's hand. When they whispered of flaws, they pointed to his habits. He was not merely a figurehead, but the living embodiment of the state. His personality, calm, patient, deeply intellectual, but also sometimes indulgent in his devotions, shaped the empire more directly than any institution could. To understand Liang is to understand the man who sat on its throne from 502 until his death in 549, an astonishing reign of nearly half a century in an age when most dynasties measured emperors' lifespans in years, not decades. What set Wu apart from many of his predecessors was his deliberate cultivation of an image as a philosopher king. He presented himself less as a warlord who seized power through blood and more as a sage who guided his people through virtue. He attended Buddhist ceremonies with the seriousness of a monk, recited Confucian classics with scholars, and composed poetry that blended introspection with political metaphor. This wasn't just affectation, it was his vision of kingship. He wanted to rule not through fear, as the paranoid Qi emperors had, but through moral authority. For a time, this worked brilliantly. Officials and commoners alike saw him as a man of learning and faith, and his aura of wisdom gave legitimacy to a dynasty that, in truth, had been born from a carefully executed coup. But beneath the scholar's robes was still the soldier who had risen from the chaos of the Qi. Wu was patient, yes, but he was not naive. He understood the machinery of power, and he kept a tight grip on it. His reliance on bureaucracy to curb aristocratic privilege reflected not only his belief in merit, but also his recognition that he needed a loyal counterweight to entrenched clans. He shuffled governors to prevent them from growing too powerful, rewarded generals who remained obedient, and crushed rebellions with decisiveness. When order was threatened, he could be ruthless. Mercy and virtue framed his public image, but behind that mask lay a pragmatist who knew that stability sometimes required iron as much as compassion. What made Wu fascinating was the way he blurred boundaries between ruler and monk, between emperor and sage. He famously performed rituals where he renounced his throne to take Buddhist vows, only to return after courtiers begged him to resume power. To some, this was a demonstration of humility, proof that he placed spiritual truth above worldly power. To others, it was political theater, carefully staged to reinforce his aura of moral legitimacy. Either way, the image stuck. Emperor Wu, the pious king, the emperor monk, the ruler whose authority flowed not from swords, but from enlightenment. In a fractured age, that kind of imagery mattered more than most decrees. Yet his governance style was not without flaws. His devotion to Buddhism, while genuine, sometimes distracted him from worldly matters. He lavished resources on temples and monks, diverting wealth from state coffers. Critics accused him of undermining the empire's finances, and though the economy held in his earlier years, the strain grew visible over time. His idealism, too, occasionally clashed with reality. He envisioned a realm ruled by virtue and compassion, but aristocrats continued to defy, peasants continued to rebel, and armies continued to strain under the weight of endless vigilance against the north. Wu's personal serenity could not erase systemic fragility. Still, his reign provided something rare in the southern dynasties: continuity. For nearly 50 years, the same emperor sat on the throne. That alone gave Liang a stability unmatched by its predecessors. Children grew up knowing no other ruler. Officials built careers under his steady hand. Monasteries flourished under his patronage. In an era of constant coups and assassinations, Wu's longevity felt miraculous. His personal authority became so entrenched that it masked deeper cracks in the system. As long as he lived, the dynasty held. It was his greatest strength and his dynasty's greatest weakness. Because when a state becomes inseparable from one man, what happens when that man falters? Wu's governance style, then, was both visionary and precarious. He embodied the sage king ideal, blending scholarship, piety, and pragmatism in ways that dazzled his contemporaries. But he also allowed the weight of the dynasty to rest too heavily on his shoulders, neglecting to build structures that could outlast him. Liang's glory was Wu's glory, but Liang's fragility was also Wu's shadow. And as the years stretched on and his devotions deepened, the balance he had maintained with such care began to tilt. Emperor Wu's religious devotion and his Buddhist entanglements became the most striking and ultimately the most controversial aspect of his reign. If his early reforms gave the Liang dynasty its backbone and his bureaucracy gave it muscle, then his Buddhist faith gave it a heart that beat with both radiance and strain. No emperor before him, in the south or the north, embraced Buddhism with such fervor. It wasn't simply a matter of sponsoring a few monasteries or inviting monks for rituals. Wu allowed Buddhism to seep into every layer of his governance, his court culture, and even his personal identity as ruler. To his admirers, this was evidence of a sage king guided by compassion and higher truth. To his critics, it was indulgence that blurred the line between throne and altar, draining resources and weakening the dynasty's secular foundations. Buddhism in Wu's era was already a powerful force in China. Carried by merchants and monks along the Silk Road, it had taken deep root in both northern and southern dynasties. But where other rulers balanced Buddhist patronage with Confucian orthodoxy, Wu tilted heavily toward the new faith. He built temples across the empire, from Jiankong's bustling avenues to remote provincial towns. He donated land, gold, and silk to monasteries, elevating them into institutions that rivaled aristocratic estates. Monks were given positions of influence at court, advising not only on spiritual matters but sometimes on politics. Sutras were translated, copied, and distributed on a scale that spread Buddhist philosophy to literate elites and common villagers alike. Wu's devotion wasn't mere symbolism. He staged public rituals of breathtaking scale, where he personally donned monk's robes, shaved his head, and declared his renunciation of worldly power. On multiple occasions, he actually abdicated temporarily, entering a monastery as a humble monk, only to be ceremoniously redeemed by courtiers who begged him to return to the throne. To the faithful, these acts demonstrated humility, the Son of Heaven himself acknowledging that even emperors were subject to the impermanence of life. To skeptics, they were political theater, choreographed performances that bolstered his legitimacy by cloaking it in piety. Either way, they left a deep impression. No one could mistake Liang for a dynasty indifferent to faith. The emperor himself had embodied it. Yet devotion carried costs. Monasteries did not simply live on prayers. They required land, labor, and donations. The wealth Wu poured into Buddhist institutions drained the treasury, especially as he aged and grew more devout. Monks exempted from taxation and corvée labor reduced the state's ability to fund armies and infrastructure. Aristocrats resented the competition, seeing monasteries as rivals for both wealth and moral authority. Confucian officials, steeped in traditions that emphasized hierarchy, filial duty, and ritual order, worried that Buddhist egalitarian ideals undermined social stability. To them, an emperor who shaved his head and bowed before monks was not a sage king, but a ruler flirting with dereliction of duty. There were also contradictions Wu himself never resolved. Buddhism preached renunciation of desire, yet his court still shimmered with luxury. Temples multiplied, yet peasants still bore the burden of taxes and conscription. Wu envisioned himself as a bodhisattva-like king, sacrificing his own indulgences for the good of the people, but the very wealth he gave to monasteries often came from those same people's labor. Compassion as principle sometimes collided with exploitation in practice, leaving a tension that neither sutras nor decrees could smooth away. Still, it would be unfair to see Wu's devotion only as folly. For decades, his sponsorship of Buddhism brought genuine benefits. Temples served as community centers, offering food, shelter, and education. Monks provided spiritual solace to a population weary from cycles of war and upheaval. The cultural flowering under his patronage, art, sculpture, and literature infused with Buddhist imagery, gave the Liang Dynasty a distinctive legacy that outlasted its political collapse. Statues carved in his time, sutras copied with imperial funding, and paintings commissioned under his reign influenced Chinese culture for centuries. The problem was not faith itself, but excess. Wu's balance shifted too far. In the early years, Buddhism was a pillar of legitimacy, complementing his reforms and cultural policies. By the later years, it became almost an obsession, absorbing resources the state could ill afford to lose. His rituals of abdication, once moving displays of humility, began to look like abdications of responsibility. When crises erupted, the Jing rebellion most famously, critics argued that his piety had dulled his pragmatism, that he had been too distracted by temples and sutras to tend to the empire's defenses. It's easy, with hindsight, to judge him harshly. But in his own time, Emperor Wu's Buddhist devotion gave the Liang Dynasty its unique character. He tried to fuse throne and altar, politics and piety, into a model of rulership unlike anything China had seen. For decades, it worked. The Liang stood out as a dynasty of culture, morality, and faith. Yet, by tying the dynasty's fate so closely to his personal devotions, Wu left it vulnerable. His piety could inspire, but it could not shield. When the storms came, and they always came, sutras could not stop swords. Military stagnation and costly campaigns formed the other side of the Liang dynasty's story, the shadow behind Emperor Wu's brilliance as a cultural and spiritual ruler. For decades, he had leaned on defense, careful diplomacy, and the shield of the Yangtze to hold the dynasty together. That strategy worked well enough when the north was distracted by its own troubles, but it had limits. An empire cannot survive on defense alone, not when aristocrats scheme in the provinces, neighbors test borders, and restless generals look for glory. Eventually, the Liang found itself straining against those limits, sending armies into the field where caution gave way to overreach, and the cracks began to spread. The military stagnation wasn't immediate. Early in Wu's reign, the army was stable, even effective in small-scale engagements. Garrisons guarded the Yangtze crossings, naval patrols secured river routes, and defensive campaigns managed to repel northern incursions. But over time, the Liang military grew complacent. Years of peace under Wu's long reign dulled the edge of commanders who had once sharpened their skills in constant conflict. Younger officers lacked the battle-hardened experience of their elders. Troops, often peasant conscripts, trained for defense but not for offensive maneuvering, leaving them ill-prepared when the dynasty tried to project power beyond its safe river shield. The structure of the army itself contributed to the stagnation. Aristocratic clans continued to hold significant commands, often prioritizing their own interests over the state's. Some withheld troops from campaigns to preserve their estates, others used their military posts as leverage against the throne. Meanwhile, Wu's loyalist commanders, chosen for merit and loyalty, sometimes lacked the prestige needed to rally provincial elites. The result was an army divided in spirit, strong on paper but fragile in execution. When the Liang did attempt offensive campaigns, the costs were staggering. One notable example came during clashes with northern states when Wu sought to exploit their internal divisions. On paper, it seemed like a perfect opportunity. Northern Wei fractured into Eastern Wei and Western Wei after a bloody split in 534, leaving both weakened. Wu believed he could press southward advantage into real territorial gain. But the Liang armies, poorly suited for long-distance campaigns, stumbled. Supply lines stretched thin, commanders bickered, and the cautious defensive training of soldiers left them ill-prepared for the fluid, fast-moving style of warfare practiced in the north. Instead of decisive victories, Liang forces suffered heavy casualties for meager gains. Even defensive campaigns grew costly. Whenever rebellions erupted in the provinces, troops had to be dispatched, draining the treasury and exhausting manpower. Soldiers pulled from farms left harvests untended, straining food supplies. Peasants conscripted into the army returned to find their families impoverished. These ripple effects weakened the economic backbone of the dynasty. Wu's government attempted to soften the blow by rotating units and providing limited stipends to families, but resources were finite. Every campaign, whether successful or not, ate away at the Liang's reserves of wealth and loyalty. Naval power, one of the Liang's strengths, also saw decline. Wu invested in fleets early on, understanding that control of the Yangtze was vital. But maintaining ships and skilled crews required constant investment. Over time, as more resources were funneled into temples and cultural projects, naval readiness slipped. Fleets that had once been the pride of Liang defense sometimes lay underfunded, their crews poorly supplied, their hulls rotting at the docks. It wasn't neglect born of ignorance. Wu knew their value, but priorities shifted, and the dynasty began to lean too heavily on its reputation for strong defenses rather than maintaining them in reality. Perhaps the most dangerous consequence of military stagnation was psychological. The dynasty's elites, cushioned by decades of relative peace, began to believe that the Liang was untouchable behind its river barrier. They mistook geography for invincibility, forgetting that rivers can be crossed, that defenses crumble when not maintained, and that patience in enemies eventually wears thin. When threats did come, whether from northern armies or internal rebels, the court was often slow to react, lulled by the illusion of permanence. That illusion would shatter in the Jing rebellion, but the seeds of disaster were planted long before, in the complacency of a dynasty that mistook defense for destiny. The irony is sharp. Emperor Wu, who had risen by being cautious, patient, and pragmatic in his early career, presided over a dynasty that grew less cautious, less disciplined, as time went on. His personal longevity, nearly half a century on the throne, gave stability, but it also encouraged habits of delay and assumption. Why rush to fix what seemed to work? Why strain the treasury on constant military reform when the Yangtze seemed eternal? Yet rivers can betray, armies can weaken, and dynasties can rot from within even as they appear calm on the surface. The Liang's military stagnation was the quiet weakening of its shield, a flaw that would only reveal itself fully when the storm arrived. The Jing rebellion was the moment when all the hidden fractures in the Liang dynasty burst open, a storm that swept away the calm emperor Wu had so carefully cultivated for nearly half a century. If the dynasty had seemed like a porcelain vase, polished to brilliance, but already laced with fine cracks, Jing's revolt was the hammer blow that shattered it. Nothing afterward was ever the same, not for the dynasty, not for the emperor, not for the people of Jiang who had lived under the illusion that stability could last. Jing himself was an unlikely figure to bring an empire to its knees. He wasn't a great clan aristocrat with centuries of prestige behind him, nor a commander raised in Liang's heartland. He was a soldier of northern origin, a man who had served the rival states of Eastern Wei and Western Wei before defecting south. In the fractured political landscape of mid-6th century China, shifting loyalties were common, but Jing was exceptional for his cunning and opportunism. He arrived in the Liang court claiming allegiance, but he carried with him ambition far larger than service to another master. Emperor Wu, trusting in his reputation for benevolence and perhaps overconfident in his ability to absorb defectors, welcomed him. It was a decision that would haunt the dynasty. The seeds of rebellion were sown in the tensions already straining Liang. The aristocracy resented Wu's favoritism toward monasteries and bureaucrats of modest backgrounds. The treasury, drained by decades of temple building and costly campaigns, struggled to fund armies adequately. Soldiers were restless, sometimes unpaid, sometimes neglected. Provincial commanders muttered about autonomy, and peasants, burdened by taxes, watched their grain disappear into granaries that seemed to feed temples more reliably than families. Jing saw opportunity in these discontents. He knew the army was stretched thin, the capital overconfident, and the emperor distracted by his devotions. In 548, Jing launched his rebellion, turning his forces against the Liang with shocking speed. At first, many in Jiang dismissed it as just another provincial revolt, one of the countless fires Wu had put out before. But He Jing was no ordinary rebel. He was ruthless, determined, and skilled in exploiting weakness. His troops marched swiftly, seizing territory and cutting off supply lines. Cities that should have resisted opened their gates, weary of Liang taxes or resentful of imperial neglect. Aristocratic families, always ambivalent about Wu's centralizing policies, sometimes looked the other way as He's forces advanced. The cracks widened into fissures. By the time He Jing reached Jiang, the capital was unprepared. The city that had dazzled with poetry and temples suddenly found itself a fortress under siege. The emperor, nearing 80, remained calm, perhaps too calm, convinced that heaven would not abandon a pious ruler. He refused to flee, preferring to stay within the capital walls, trusting in virtue and ritual even as rebels tightened their grip. The siege that followed was brutal. Supplies dwindled, hunger spread, and the once vibrant capital became a place of desperation. Temples that had once received imperial gifts now struggled to feed starving crowds. Poetry gave way to the moans of the hungry. The betrayal cut deeper because He Jing had once been welcomed as a guest. To many, it felt like heaven itself had turned its back on the dynasty. How could an emperor who had devoted his life to Buddhism, who had sponsored temples and lived as a monk king, face such calamity? Some saw it as proof that his faith had gone too far, distracting him from the practical duties of defense and governance. Others clung to him, believing his suffering was a test, a karmic trial of virtue. Either way, the rebellion exposed the dynasty's fragility in the starkest terms. What made the He Jing rebellion so devastating wasn't just the fighting, it was the collapse of belief. The Liang's legitimacy had rested on the promise that Wu's virtue held the empire together. When Jiang starved under siege, that promise crumbled. The aristocracy no longer trusted the throne to protect them. Soldiers no longer trusted that their sacrifices would be rewarded. Peasants no longer trusted that their labor would bring stability. Even monks, beneficiaries of Wu's generosity, could not reconcile the emperor's piety with the chaos consuming his people. The rebellion wasn't merely a military defeat, it was a spiritual and moral unmasking. By 549, Jiang fell. He Jing seized the city, taking Emperor Wu himself captive in his own palace. The sage king, who had ruled for nearly half a century, who had knelt in temples as both emperor and monk, was reduced to a prisoner of the very man he had once welcomed. The empire that had flourished under culture and piety was now ruled by a warlord whose brutality knew few bounds. The He Jing rebellion marked the beginning of the end for the Liang. What followed was not merely decline but disintegration, as the dynasty that had seemed to embody refinement and stability dissolved into blood, betrayal, and hunger. The capture of Jiang and the collapse of stability was not just the fall of a capital city, it was the unraveling of everything the Liang dynasty had promised to be. For nearly half a century, Jiang had stood as the proud showcase of Southern culture, a place of poetry, temples, refined banquets, and imperial rituals that projected the illusion of permanence. When He Jing's forces breached its defenses in 549, that illusion shattered overnight. The city that had embodied elegance became a prison of hunger, fear, and betrayal, and the dynasty that had seemed so rooted in virtue collapsed into chaos before the eyes of its own people. The siege itself had already tested Jiang beyond endurance. By the time He Jing's army stormed its gates, the population was starving. Granaries had been depleted, and relief convoys never arrived. Aristocrats who once hosted banquets now rationed scraps of rice. Peasants who had flocked to the city for safety scavenged weeds and tree bark. Disease spread in the crowded, malnourished streets. Corpses went unburied. The temples, once resplendent with incense and gilded statues, became shelters for the desperate, their sacred halls echoing with the cries of the hungry. The capital, so long a stage for ritual and refinement, reeked of rot and despair. He Jing's capture of Jiang was not a moment of sudden, decisive conquest. It was the culmination of slow suffocation, the final breach after months of attrition. When his troops entered, they did not find a proud, defiant city, they found a broken one. Resistance was scattered and futile. The emperor, too old and too devoted to ideals of virtue to flee, remained in the palace, waiting for fate to decide his end. For the people, the arrival of Ho's men was not liberation but confirmation that their world had collapsed. The fall of the city unleashed horrors that cut deeper than the siege itself. Ho Jing's men looted Jiang, stripping mansions and temples alike of wealth. Aristocratic families who had once strutted through the court in silks now cowered in rags, their estates confiscated, their servants scattered. Monks, once revered for their piety, were humiliated, their temples desecrated. Women of noble and common birth alike were subjected to violence. The social order that had defined Liang's promise, that elegant divide between cultured elites and the laboring masses, collapsed into chaos as Ho Jing ruled with brutality rather than legitimacy. For Emperor Wu, the humiliation was personal and profound. The sage king who had spent decades cultivating an image of philosopher and monk was reduced to a captive in his own palace, guarded by soldiers who had once been his subjects. Ho Jing treated him as a pawn, forcing him to issue decrees in the rebel's name, turning the emperor into a puppet. It was a cruel irony. The ruler who had presented himself as a bodhisattva-like figure of compassion and moral authority now found himself powerless, starved, and humiliated. Accounts suggest he was deprived of food, left to waste away in the palace where he had once presided over banquets and rituals. For the people, seeing their emperor reduced to such a state was devastating. If even the Son of Heaven could be brought so low, what hope was left for the dynasty? The collapse of Jiang was more than a military defeat, it was the psychological breaking point of the Liang. Aristocrats who had once tolerated Wu's centralization now abandoned any sense of loyalty. Generals in the provinces, already semi-autonomous, ceased to obey the capital. Peasants, who had once believed in the promise of stability under Wu's reign, saw only betrayal and suffering. Even the monks, who had flourished under imperial patronage, could not explain why a ruler so pious was allowed by heaven to fall into such degradation. The mandate of heaven, in the eyes of many, had clearly shifted. The tragedy of Jiang's fall lies not just in the suffering it caused, but in the way it inverted the very identity of the Liang Dynasty. What had been celebrated as a dynasty of culture, virtue, and refinement became a byword for collapse and ruin. The capital, once the jewel of the south, became a graveyard of hope. And Emperor Wu, who had dreamed of ruling as a sage king, became instead a symbol of fragility, a warning of what happens when piety and refinement are unaccompanied by vigilance and strength. In the end, Jiang's capture revealed the truth that had always lurked beneath Liang's elegance. Stability had been an illusion held together by one man's authority, one man's balance of culture and control. Once that balance cracked, everything crumbled. Ho Jing's rebellion did not just conquer a city, it exposed the dynasty's foundation as brittle, its promises as hollow, its glory as fleeting. The collapse of Jiang was the collapse of the Liang itself, even if the dynasty staggered on for a few more years in name. The heart had been pierced, and without the heart, the body could not survive. Emperor Wu's final days were a slow-motion tragedy, a drawn-out unraveling that mirrored the collapse of the Liang dynasty itself. For nearly half a century, he had been the steady center of the southern court, scholar, monk, ruler, philosopher. He had outlasted rivals, held the Yangtze as a shield, presided over decades of cultural brilliance, and built temples that glittered like jewels. But when Ho Jing's rebellion consumed Jiang and reduced the emperor to a captive in his own palace, all that splendor fell away. What remained was an old man, nearly 80, besieged by hunger and humiliation, stripped of the authority he had once embodied so completely. His end was not swift or glorious. It was slow, pitiful, and haunting, a lesson in how quickly fortune can turn even for those who seemed closest to heaven. Ho Jing treated Emperor Wu not with the deference owed to the Son of Heaven, but as a pawn, a tool to give his rule the faintest illusion of legitimacy. He forced the emperor to issue decrees in his name, mocking the very rituals that had once defined Wu's authority. Yet, even as a puppet, the emperor posed a problem. As long as he lived, he remained a symbol of continuity. Ho Jing could control his body, but he couldn't erase the reverence the people still felt for him. To weaken that reverence, Ho resorted to slow cruelty. Wu was denied food, left to waste away in the same palace where he had once presided over feasts and rituals. Courtiers who had once dined on delicacies now watched in horror as their emperor starved before their eyes. It is hard to overstate the symbolism of this hunger. Wu had spent his life championing Buddhism, a faith that preached compassion, charity, and the feeding of the poor. He had poured wealth into temples, ensuring that monks and pilgrims alike could find sustenance under the empire's patronage. And yet, in his last days, he himself was deprived of the most basic mercy: food. He had envisioned himself as a sage king who ruled through virtue, yet he died not in a blaze of enlightenment, but in the slow gnawing of emptiness. To contemporaries, it must have felt like a cosmic betrayal. How could heaven allow a ruler so pious, so devoted, to die in such degradation? To later historians, it became the defining irony of his reign. Witnesses wrote that the once dignified emperor grew frail and emaciated, his skin clinging to bone, his spirit dimmed but not extinguished. He still spoke with calmness when he could, still held to rituals even in captivity, but each day drained him further. For the court and for the people of Jiang, his suffering was both heartbreaking and terrifying. If even the Son of Heaven could starve, what chance did ordinary mortals have? His hunger became a mirror of the empire's collapse, for just as his body wasted away, so too did the state around him. The emperor and the dynasty were dying together, each feeding the symbolism of the other's decline. Wu's death in 549 was not a blaze of glory, but a fading into shadow. He did not fall in battle, nor was he executed with the dramatic finality of a sword. He simply wasted away, consumed by neglect and cruelty, until life left him quietly in the same halls where he had once embodied Southern civilization's hopes. His body, frail and weakened, was laid to rest without the grandeur befitting an emperor who had ruled so long. Even his funeral was tainted by the indignity of Ho Jing's dominance, stripped of the solemnity and ritual that should have marked the passing of a sage king. Yet his death was more than the end of a man, it was the end of an illusion. For decades, the Liang Dynasty's strength had rested on his shoulders. He had projected order, virtue, and piety, and for as long as he lived, people believed those qualities held the empire together. But his starvation revealed the fragility of that belief. When he died, not only did the dynasty lose its emperor, it lost the very idea of stability that he had personified. The collapse was no longer theoretical, it was embodied in the image of an old man, once the Son of Heaven, reduced to skin and bone by the very rebel he had once welcomed into his fold. In later retellings, Wu's final days became a parable of excess faith and misplaced trust. Some said his obsession with Buddhism distracted him from governance, leaving the dynasty vulnerable. Others argued that his piety made him blind to treachery, too willing to believe Ho Jing's loyalty. But beyond the debates, one truth remained clear: his end was one of the most tragic of any emperor in Chinese history. He had sought to live as a philosopher king, to embody compassion and virtue, but he died as a prisoner of his own ideals, caught in the jaws of betrayal and hunger. The fall of Emperor Wu was the fall of the Liang itself. His death didn't just mark the loss of a ruler, it extinguished the dynasty's guiding light. Without him, the Liang staggered on in name, but its spirit had already died within the starving walls of Jiang. Ho Jing's puppet court was a grotesque parody of the Liang dynasty that had once embodied refinement and stability. When Jiang fell and Emperor Wu was reduced to a prisoner, Ho Jing stepped into the halls of power not as a conqueror who swept away the old order, but as a usurper who draped himself in its skin. He understood that legitimacy in China wasn't won solely by force of arms. It had to be clothed in ritual, titles, and the illusion of continuity. And so, instead of abolishing the Liang outright, he kept the dynasty's trappings, emperors on the throne, decrees issued in familiar form, but behind the curtain, every decision, every cruelty, bore his hand. What followed was not governance, but spectacle, a hollow theater of power that deepened the suffering of a city already bled dry. After Emperor Wu's death in 549, Ho installed Wu's grandson, Xiaodong, as a puppet ruler. This boy, barely more than a figurehead, was expected to project the continuity of the dynasty even as his court was stripped of real authority. Ho styled himself as Prime Minister and Grand Commander, holding titles that in name made him a servant of the throne, but in reality made him master of everything. Decrees went out under the emperor's seal, but everyone knew they were Ho's words. Ministers who once debated policy now cowered before him, knowing a hint of dissent meant imprisonment or execution. Aristocratic families that had cultivated prestige for centuries were reduced to supplicants at the rebel's court, their wealth seized, their daughters vulnerable to his whims. Jiang itself suffered most under this puppet regime. Already devastated by siege, the city was drained further by Ho's demands. He confiscated estates, looted temples, and imposed levies that bled the survivors. The capital that had once buzzed with markets and music became a hollowed shell, its streets patrolled by soldiers loyal only to their warlord. Hunger lingered even after the siege ended, for Ho cared little for relief. Instead, he lived like a conqueror in a conquered land, feasting while the population starved. Where Emperor Wu had once projected piety and restraint, Ho flaunted indulgence and cruelty, shocking a society that had built its identity on refinement. The puppet court also became a stage of paranoia. Ho trusted no one fully, not even the puppet emperors he placed on the throne. Xiaodong, the boy he installed, lasted barely months before Ho forced him to abdicate. In his place, Ho elevated another prince of the Xiao clan, Xiaoji, hoping to placate those who still clung to the dynasty's name. But each substitution only revealed the farce more clearly. Liang emperors were no longer rulers but dolls, propped up and discarded at Ho's whim. The dynasty's prestige, already wounded, became a laughingstock. Aristocratic resentment deepened. The great families, who had long resented Wu's efforts to curb their power, now found themselves stripped of even the privileges they had preserved. Ho confiscated their estates, redistributed lands to his soldiers, and humiliated them in public. For a society that valued lineage as much as wealth, this was unbearable. Many nobles began secretly conspiring with provincial commanders, hoping to overthrow Ho and restore some semblance of order. These plots rarely succeeded. Ho's spies and brutality kept him in power for several years, but they revealed how little legitimacy his puppet court truly held. Religious institutions also suffered. The Buddhist temples that Emperor Wu had endowed so lavishly were looted, their treasures melted down to fund Ho's armies. Monks were stripped of their privileges, some even executed on suspicion of harboring resistance. Confucian officials fared no better, their lectures on virtue reduced to whispers in a city where brute force dictated truth. The cultural and spiritual fabric that had defined the Liang was torn apart, leaving Jiang not only politically broken but spiritually hollow. For the common people, life under Ho's puppet court was worse than the siege. At least during the siege, hunger was the enemy. Now hunger was joined by humiliation, exploitation, and violence. Women were taken as concubines for soldiers, families displaced, and the faint hope that stability might return under a new ruler was extinguished by the realization that Ho ruled only for himself. The dynasty's name remained, but its soul had been gutted. Yet Ho's rule, for all its brutality, was never secure. Provincial commanders in the south refused to fully recognize his authority. Armies rallied in distant provinces under princes of the Xiao clan, vowing to avenge Emperor Wu and free the capital. Rebellions smoldered constantly, sometimes sparked by aristocrats, sometimes by desperate peasants. Ho could crush them, but each uprising drained his forces, each betrayal deepened his paranoia. His puppet court, designed to cloak him in legitimacy, became a cage of instability. The tragedy of the puppet court was that it preserved the name of Liang while destroying everything that had given the dynasty meaning. Ho wanted the prestige of ruling an empire, but he lacked the vision to govern one. He mistook titles for legitimacy, fear for loyalty, and plunder for prosperity. His regime was a husk, recognizable in form, hollow in substance. And in that hollowness lay the final insult. The Liang still existed, but only as a mask worn by the man who had starved its emperor and bled its capital. For many, it was worse than outright conquest. The puppet court lasted only a few years, but in those years it burned away the last embers of faith in the dynasty. When Ho himself fell, killed by the very instability he had unleashed, the Liang was beyond saving. Its body still twitched, but its soul was gone, sacrificed on the altar of one man's ambition and cruelty. Attempts at recovery by loyalists after the nightmare of Ho Jing's rule were as desperate as they were heroic, a last attempt to stitch together the tattered robes of the Liang Dynasty before the fabric disintegrated completely. When Jiang fell and Ho Jing turned the capital into his personal fief, the empire did not vanish all at once. Beyond the city's starving walls, in the provinces that had always enjoyed a measure of autonomy, members of the Shao clan and loyalist generals still clung to the idea that the dynasty could be salvaged. They raised banners in Wu's name, called upon the mandate of heaven, and promised to restore the order that Ho had defiled. And for a moment, it seemed possible. For a moment, Liang might still have had a second life. The princes of the Shao family were scattered across the provinces, each with their own small base of power. Some were provincial governors, others commanders stationed far from Jiang, and all of them were horrified by Ho Jing's betrayal. They seized on the emperor's captivity and later his death as proof that Ho had violated heaven's will. They proclaimed themselves defenders of the dynasty, rallying soldiers, aristocrats, and peasants alike with cries of vengeance. Armies marched not just against Ho Jing, but in the name of restoring the dignity of the throne. To peasants who had watched their fields burned and their families scattered, the promise of revenge carried weight. To aristocrats humiliated by Ho's confiscations, it carried even more. Yet loyalist recovery efforts were fractured from the beginning. Each Shao prince claimed to fight for the dynasty, but each also had ambitions of his own. Some declared themselves emperors outright, hoping to inherit Wu's mantle. Others clung to the idea of acting as regents for puppet emperors who could be installed once Jiang was retaken. The result was a patchwork of courts, each flying the Liang banner, but issuing decrees that often contradicted one another. Instead of unity, Ho Jing faced an opposition divided by rivalries. And division, in times of crisis, can be as fatal as open rebellion. Military campaigns were launched from multiple fronts. In the West, forces loyal to Shao Yi, a son of Emperor Wu, began consolidating power in Jiangling, creating what was in effect a rival court. In the southeast, other princes tried to gather strength in the fertile provinces that bordered the coast. These efforts strained resources already weakened by decades of war and taxation. Armies marched, but supplies were scarce, soldiers often poorly trained, and loyalties unstable. Ho Jing, though loathed, was ruthless and experienced. He exploited divisions among the loyalists, crushing their forces piecemeal. Still, the loyalist cause wasn't entirely hopeless. Many in the provinces despised Ho's cruelty and longed for a return to legitimacy. Aristocrats funneled wealth into the resistance, monks offered sanctuaries and supplies, and peasants rose in local uprisings whenever loyalist armies approached. There were flashes of triumph, rebel garrisons routed, cities retaken, puppet decrees overturned. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the loyalists might actually succeed in reclaiming the heartland. But the momentum never lasted. Victory in one province was undermined by defeat in another, and rival Shao princes often quarreled instead of cooperating. The loyalists' greatest weakness was geography. Jiang, the capital, lay at the empire's center, a prize all factions coveted but few could effectively seize. To retake it required coordination, supplies, and unity, none of which the loyalists possessed in sufficient measure. Armies reached its outskirts, only to falter under Ho Jing's defenses or be called back to defend their own provinces from rival princes. Each failed attempt eroded morale. Soldiers who had sworn to restore the dynasty began deserting, peasants who had hoped for deliverance grew disillusioned, and aristocrats began hedging their bets, wondering if the Liang banner was worth backing at all. The tragedy of these recovery attempts was not only their failure, but the way they deepened the dynasty's fragmentation. Instead of restoring unity, the rival Shao princes turned the empire into a battlefield of competing claims. Each declared himself the rightful heir of Wu's legacy, but in doing so, they weakened the very legitimacy they claimed to defend. The Liang name still carried weight, but it was being torn apart by those who clung to it most fiercely. By the early 550s, it was clear that He Jing's fall, when it came, would not mean Liang's revival. Even without him, the dynasty had already been hollowed out. The loyalists, brave though they were, could not overcome their divisions. The attempt to recover Liang's dignity only highlighted its irreversible decline. The dynasty staggered on, but its days as a unified power were over. For those who fought under the Liang banner, these years must have felt like watching a loved one on their deathbed. They fought not just for power, but for memory, for the idea that Emperor Wu's long reign of culture and piety had meant something more than hunger and betrayal. They failed, but their struggle lingered as the last echo of Liang's glory. Provincial warlords and rival claimants soon turned the Liang dynasty into a shattered mosaic of competing powers, each fragment claiming to carry the legacy of Emperor Wu, but in truth accelerating the dynasty's disintegration. What had begun as loyalist attempts to resist He Jing gradually mutated into a civil war among the Shao clan itself. Brothers, cousins, and uncles, all princes of the imperial family, raised banners in different corners of the south. Each declared himself the true guardian, or even the true emperor, of the Liang. Instead of restoring order, they pulled the empire apart, leaving ordinary people trapped between rival armies that marched, fought, and looted in the name of a dynasty that had already lost its heart. The provinces had always been semi-autonomous under Wu's reign, but after Jiankong's fall, autonomy hardened into independence. Shao Yi, one of Wu's sons, entrenched himself in Jiangling and built a powerful base in the west, presenting himself as the most capable heir. Other princes claimed territory along the lower Yangtze or in the southeastern coastlands. Each built their own court, complete with officials, armies, and seals of authority. On paper, they were still part of the Liang. In practice, they were rival kingdoms, more concerned with undermining each other than defeating He Jing. This fragmentation made it impossible to coordinate strategy, and He, ruthless as ever, exploited the divisions. He crushed some claimants directly, while others simply exhausted themselves fighting one another. The aristocracy, instead of providing a unifying force, made the chaos worse. Great families, already resentful of Wu's earlier attempts to curb their power, now saw an opportunity to expand their own influence. Some threw their weight behind one prince, others behind another, shifting allegiances as fortunes changed. Landed estates became miniature strongholds, and peasants found themselves bound more tightly to local lords than to any imperial figure. For many aristocrats, the dynasty was no longer a cause worth saving, it was simply a banner of convenience, something to legitimize their local dominance. The military situation reflected this fragmentation. Each claimant had his own forces, peasant levies conscripted from nearby villages, retainers from aristocratic households, and remnants of Liang's once proud armies. But the quality of these forces varied wildly. Some were disciplined and loyal, others poorly trained and prone to desertion. Campaigns became less about defending the dynasty and more about raiding rivals, capturing cities, and plundering the countryside. For the common people, it made little difference whether the soldiers who seized their grain marched under He Jing's banner or that of a Shao prince. Hunger and devastation spread either way. Religion, once a unifying force under Emperor Wu's piety, became another tool in the struggle. Some princes sponsored Buddhist temples, hoping to claim their father's mantle of compassion and piety. Others leaned more heavily on Confucian rhetoric, presenting themselves as restorers of order and filial duty. Monks and scholars, too, became pawns, courted by rival courts for their prestige. But these gestures rang hollow in the face of constant bloodshed. Temples that had once symbolized spiritual refuge now echoed with the cries of refugees and the tramp of soldiers requisitioning supplies. The tragedy was compounded by geography. The Liang heartland was rich in farmland and waterways, but it was also difficult to control as a single unit. Rivers divided territories, making coordination difficult, while mountains isolated provinces. In earlier times, The Yangtze had been a shield, now it became a barrier separating rival courts. Provinces that might have been lifelines for Jiang instead turned into bases for warlords who had little interest in restoring the old order. By the early 550s, the south was a battlefield of rival claimants. Ho Jing still clung to Jiang, though increasingly besieged and hated. Shao Yi and other princes fought for supremacy, sometimes against Ho, sometimes against each other. The dynasty still existed in name, but what did that name mean when multiple emperors issued contradictory decrees, when armies looted their own people, when the throne was reduced to a prize in a family feud? To many commoners, the Liang was no longer a dynasty at all. It was a memory, a story told about the days before warlords and rebels carved the empire into pieces. And yet, in a bitter irony, this fragmentation also kept the Liang name alive longer than it otherwise might have lasted. Rival claimants, even as they destroyed one another, refused to abandon the dynasty's banner. Each insisted he was the true heir, the true defender of Wu's legacy. They wore the dynasty like armor, even as they gutted it from within. It was survival in name, extinction in substance. The age of warlords and rival emperors made clear that Liang's fate was sealed. It could stagger on, its name shouted by princes and written on decrees, but the dynasty's unity was irretrievable. The dream of a cultured, Buddhist-tinged state guided by a philosopher king had died with Emperor Wu. What remained was a scramble for his ashes, fought by men who claimed to honor his memory even as they trampled it underfoot. Western Wei's intervention and the fall of Jiang marked the moment when Liang's fate was no longer in its own hands. Internal feuds and Ho Jing's devastation had already hollowed the dynasty, but when outside powers began to exploit the chaos, the end became inevitable. What had once been an empire defined by its balance against the north now became prey to northern armies, who saw opportunity in Liang's collapse and seized it without hesitation. Jiang, the stronghold of Shao Yi, one of Emperor Wu's sons and perhaps the most capable of the surviving princes, became the crucible where the dynasty's last real chance of revival was destroyed. Shao Yi had carved out a power base in the west, in Jiang along the Yangtze's middle reaches. Unlike some of his cousins, who squandered energy in petty squabbles, Shao Yi combined administrative skill with military pragmatism. He drew scholars to his court, built alliances with provincial families, and positioned himself as the true heir of Emperor Wu's legitimacy. For a time, his court at Jiang looked like a miniature echo of Jiang before its fall, officials reciting poetry, monks chanting sutras, commanders pledging loyalty. He even managed to mount campaigns that weakened Ho Jing's grip on Jiang, presenting himself as the dynasty's savior. For weary Southerners, his rule held out hope that Liang might not just survive but rebuild. But ambition has its costs, and Shao Yi's growing strength alarmed Western Wei. That state, forged from the ruins of Northern Wei's split, was ruled by a leadership as pragmatic as it was ruthless. Its generals saw in Liang not a respected rival but a vulnerable target. They understood that if Shao Yi consolidated power, he might eventually rebuild the South into a formidable barrier again. Far better, from their perspective, to strike early while Liang was still fragmented. And so, under the guise of intervention, Western Wei launched its campaign. The assault on Jiang in 554 was brutal and decisive. Western Wei's armies, disciplined and hardened by years of warfare on the northern plains, marched south with efficiency that Liang's fragmented forces could not match. Shao Yi's defenses, though stout, were not enough. His army lacked the numbers and coordination to resist such an onslaught, and his allies, distracted by their own rivalries, offered little meaningful support. Jiang fell after fierce fighting, and with it, Shao Yi's dream of restoring Liang crumbled. The fall was not just military but symbolic. Shao Yi had been the last prince who seemed capable of reviving the dynasty as more than a hollow name. His court had offered a vision of continuity, Confucian order, Buddhist patronage, imperial dignity that reminded people of Emperor Wu's earlier reign. When Jiang fell, that vision died. Western Wei captured Shao Yi and executed him, parading his defeat as proof that the South could no longer resist the North. It was a humiliation not just for one prince, but for the entire dynasty, whose authority was now reduced to scattered remnants with no true center. The people of Jiangling suffered as conquerors always made the defeated suffer. The city was looted, its granaries emptied, its families scattered. Aristocrats who had supported Shaoyi were stripped of their estates or executed, monks were displaced, and soldiers either killed or absorbed into northern armies. For the common people, it must have felt like the final betrayal. They had endured years of war, famine, and rebellion in the hope of salvation, only to see salvation itself destroyed by outsiders. Western Wei's intervention marked a turning point in the story of Liang. Until then, its collapse had been largely the product of internal rot, aristocratic rivalry, Ho Jing's rebellion, Emperor Wu's distractions. After Jiangling, the dynasty was no longer simply dying from within, it was being carved apart from without. The North had come not as a temporary raider, but as an executioner, ending the last serious Liang attempt at revival. In hindsight, Shaoyi's fall shows the cruel paradox of the dynasty's final years. He was capable, ambitious, and determined, but he could not overcome the structural weaknesses his father had left behind. Emperor Wu's long reign had tied stability to his personal authority without building institutions strong enough to endure after him. Shaoyi tried to rebuild those institutions in miniature, but by then it was too late. The aristocrats were too fractured, the provinces too autonomous, the armies too brittle, and the north too watchful. Jiangling's fall wasn't just the defeat of a city, it was the end of the dynasty's last real hope. Afterward, what remained of Liang was a hollow shell, a dynasty in name only. Puppet emperors would still be installed, banners still raised, but everyone knew the truth. The Liang had been gutted, and its corpse lay in Jiangling's ruins. The dynasty's final collapse and the long shadow of the Sui marked the quiet epilogue to a story that had begun with promise and ended in ashes. After the fall of Jiangling in 554 and the execution of Shaoyi, the Liang no longer had a true center of power. What remained was a dynasty in name only, its banner passed from one puppet to another, its throne treated like a stage prop by warlords and northern invaders. The once proud empire that had boasted of culture, piety, and stability now flickered like a dying lamp, each new emperor weaker, each new claimant less credible. For the people who lived through it, the Liang was no longer a dynasty but a memory, an echo of the long reign of Emperor Wu, now distorted by chaos and humiliation. Western Wei, and later its successor states, continued to meddle in the south, propping up puppet emperors when it suited them, tearing them down when they no longer had use. Xiao Yuanming, a cousin of the imperial clan, was briefly installed as a figurehead, but his authority extended little beyond the reach of the northern armies that supported him. In Jiankang and other cities, the Liang name was invoked in decrees and ceremonies, but everyone knew the dynasty's reality. Power lay not with the Xiao family, but with whoever controlled the soldiers. Legitimacy, once rooted in culture and morality under Emperor Wu, had been stripped bare, leaving only brute force. The remnants of Liang staggered on for a few more years, but the dynasty had become a political football, kicked back and forth between warlords, rival Xiao princes, and northern powers. By the late 550s, the dynasty's shell was so hollow that when the Qin family rose from the military ranks and established their own dynasty in 557, the transition was almost anticlimactic. The Chen presented themselves as restorers of order, but in truth they were opportunists stepping into a vacuum left by Liang's collapse. The Xiao clan, once an aristocratic lineage at the height of power, was reduced to pawns or exiles. The dream of a Buddhist Confucian empire guided by a philosopher king had long since died with Emperor Wu in his starving palace. For the common people of the South, the final collapse of Liang was less about dynastic banners than about survival. Farmers still bent over their fields, soldiers still marched through villages demanding grain, monks still prayed in temples, even as rulers changed above them. What mattered was no longer whether the emperor was named Xiao or Qin, whether he claimed to be heir to Liang or founder of something new. What mattered was whether he could feed them, protect them, and restore some measure of stability to lives broken by decades of rebellion and war. In that sense, the Qin dynasty's rise was less a fresh start than a continuation of Liang's failure, a stopgap solution in a world still yearning for real unity. And that yearning would eventually be fulfilled, not by the Liang, not by the Qin, but by the Sui. When the Sui unified China in 589, sweeping away the Qin and ending nearly 3 centuries of division, they did so in the long shadow cast by the Liang's collapse. The memory of Jiankong's fall, of Emperor Wu's hunger, of Hojing's cruelty, lingered as cautionary tales. The Sui rulers presented themselves as restorers of order after centuries of chaos, promising that no emperor would again be reduced to a puppet in his own palace, no dynasty left to rot behind a river it mistook for a wall. The Liang story thus became both a warning and a lesson. It showed the dangers of tying stability too tightly to a single ruler's charisma, of indulging faith without maintaining strength, of allowing aristocrats to undermine central power, of mistaking cultural brilliance for political security. It also showed the resilience of the Chinese imperial tradition itself. Even as one dynasty starved, fractured, and fell, the ideal of unity remained, waiting for the next ruler who could embody it. In the end, the Liang dynasty is remembered not for its triumphs, but for its tragedies. It rose with promise under Emperor Wu, a ruler who tried to be both monk and king, sage and sovereign. It flourished in culture, leaving behind poetry, temples, and art that outlasted its politics. But it fell with cruelty and humiliation, its capital starved, its emperor imprisoned, its princes squabbling, its people left broken. From its ashes came new dynasties, new hopes, and eventually the reunification under the Sui. But the memory of Liang lingered, a dynasty that tried to build an empire on virtue and devotion, only to discover that virtue without vigilance cannot withstand rebellion, hunger, and ambition. The Liang dynasty ended not with a clean break, but with a whimpering fade, its name stretched thin until it snapped. Yet in that very fragility lies its haunting power, the story of a dynasty that embodied the heights of culture and the depths of collapse, a reminder that even the most elegant empires can starve when their shield cracks, their faith blinds, and their unity shatters.